Ah, the ancient world, the beginnings of recorded history. That would be about 3,500 BC or BCE in Mesopotamia, the land between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. That's going from west to east. Yes. And that would be in Sumeria, beginnings of written records, notation, but it is just verbal notation. We'll have to wait a while before we have musical notation. So to stand in place, here's a little bit of the rocky music that possibly dates back to the Middle Ages, the Passion of 1,001 Nights, the stories of Scheherazade, the backstory where the ruler leaves and discovers that his wife is cheating on him. He decides that the way to enforce female faithfulness is to love him in the evening and kill him in the morning, and Scheherazade is the next one up, and instead she saves her sister from this fate. She tells the ruler a bedtime story with a continued next night, and she does that for 1,001 nights. And while the stories were first compiled in about AD or B or CE 800, some of the tales may go back to ancient times. And what do you hear in this music? Do, do, re, me, re, fi, me, re, do, re, do, me, re, do, ti, do. A synthetic scale. You can't play those on the white notes of the piano. It has aspects of minor, do, re, me, fi. It has aspects of a scale we're just about to talk about, the Lydian scale, and it has a ti, do, and the second phrase, so, so, fi, so, is the fifth up. Lots of pieces in the middle go up to the fifth, the dominant note, as opposed to the first degree of the scale, the tonic tone, and dominant. Often we've seen a lot of these pieces when they're at the fifth, they stay there for a while. It's as if the note, dominates for quite a while. It's an unfortunate term these days, isn't it? So here's how that piece goes on the keyboard. And the second phrase up here on the so. Now there's wonderful things happening here. Do, re, mi, fi, sol, fi, me, re, do, ti, do. But before we get to that, let's go back to old friend C major and notice whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So 2 whole steps, a half, 3 whole steps, a half. And it's almost like the half steps are framers. What are the 2 most really fundamental numbers after the number 1? Well, 2 and 3. Any higher number you can make from 2s and 3s, right? 2 plus 2, or 5 as 2 plus 3, or 3 plus 2, or 6 as 3 plus 3, or 2 plus 2 plus 2. You get the idea. So by setting off 2 whole steps, partitioned by that half step, and then 3 whole steps, that's some sort of fundamental. And notice that seeing the pattern of whole steps and half steps on a piano is actually easier than in notation. Let's see what happens if we start on that F and we do all white notes. Whole step, but then, whoops, we're supposed to have half step here. Here's a whole step. And that kind of scale is not a major scale, but called a Lydian scale. And the solfege here would be do, re, mi, fi, sol, la, ti, do. And notice you could change this F Lydian scale into F major by slightly altering the whole step, half step pattern as whole, and then we would use the B flat. And then the whole step here. Voila, F major. And you might have noticed that the B flat was at the front end of the piece as a key signature. And when you place an accidental, a sharp, or a flat at the front end, it's very powerful and it affects all the notes on that liner space. and any other same name notes throughout the composition or section. Haven't mentioned this before, but the spaces in treble clef form a word, F-A-C-E, and also form what's known as an F major seventh. Here is an F chord, F major, and it's do, mi, so. And then this would be a T, and you can also think of this as 1, 3, 5, 7. Very nice, and we'll hear lots of these later. Not only F, but in other keys. The lines of treble clef, unfortunately, do not spell a word, unless you think a word is egebedf. However, you can think of it with the mnemonic, every good boy does fine. And that forms an E minor, do, me, so. Not just seventh, and that's an E minor seventh, by the way, but root, third, fifth, seventh, ninth, which is a little on the dissonant side, but kind of cool anyway, right? Okay, a little ahead of ourselves again, but since we're talking notation, here is a bit on the evolution of bass clef and also the C clef. And as you can see, that C clef, even way back then, did not look particularly C-ish. And here's a bass clef. We've seen some of the evolution before, have we not? But that's backwards. So here's what an F Lydian scale sounds like and looks like in bass clef, much lower than the treble clef. Just found this app. And so the bass clef, pretty much for low singers and low instruments. Matter of fact, this is really towards the bottom of my range. F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And notice that's right before middle C. So middle C is one ledger line above bass clef and one ledger line below treble. And here's what it all looks like. And to do this, I really do have to go back to the piano. So this is a full compass of notes. 2 octaves C to C, from C in the bass clef, C3, through middle C, C4, to high C, C5. And you can see some of the transitions. It's very typical for bass clef instruments to play slightly higher into the bass clef, so you need some ledger lines. It's also pretty typical for the treble instruments to play low. Amongst those treble instruments that typically play low, clarinet down to an E below the staff, violin down to a G, and bass clef instruments, definitely the bassoon, trombone, and cello are regularly expected to play several ledger lines above, but there is another solution for those instruments. All right, here we go. Starting from this low G, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. It's about as far as I want to go. Or is it? Here's back to Guido's notes that he expected his male singers, including the countertenors, singing really against the tenor, even higher. Oh, and he's also going to be using the B and B flat. Remember that? So here we go, and we're going to change from bass to treble without seeing the overlaps as we did before. G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. Here's where he takes his option. B flat, B natural, now on treble clef, C, D, E, F, G, A. He takes the option here again. B flat, B natural, C, D, E. Now I'm done. In England, they say every good boy deserves favor. And I suppose you could also make it a chocoholics addiction. Every good boy deserves fudge. In the bass clef, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, neither the spaces nor the lines form a word. So mnemonics on both cases. And once again, this newly discovered app. The other one I've been using with the flute sound only goes down to C3, which is the C in the bass clef. And this is the whole range you might see above this. Yes. See those notes up there? The whole range of the 88. Okay, so the notes, the spaces in bass clef, and we've got all cows eat grass, A, C, E, G. That's an A minor seventh chord. Or all cars eat gas. Not very scientific, but it certainly seems to be truer and truer in the case of my vehicle. And the lines, once again, a ninth chord. E, D. This is now a G dominant ninth. F, A. Good boys do fine always, or good boys don't fool around, or something about animals. And that leaves us with the C clef, which doesn't at all look like a C anymore. And this is the only clef that still moves in the present day. And there'll be more of this almost directly. But that is the C clef where all the action is in the middle of the staff, and you're looking at middle C right there. And that alto clef is used for precisely one instrument in the orchestra, and that is the viola, which has almost an equal number of notes below middle C as above. Whereas three instruments, and they would be the upper range of the bassoon, the trombone, and the cello, use this manifestation of the C clef, which here is called the tenor clef. And once again, that's middle C. And in particular, in orchestras, if you write very high in bass clef, the bassoonists and trombonists and cellists may abuse you, saying, hey, use the tenor clef. But, truth to tell, they all kind of read high bass clef, and some of them even will read treble clef. And in the old days, everybody seemingly read a lot of clefs. When the musical staff was invented, you may recall it codified as 4 lines rather than 5, and there is a monstrous account of all the clefs that used to be used in music. I remember that even as recently, shall we say, as the Baroque era, music of Handel. Matter of fact, it was a publication from the 19th century, and I was reading the tenor part as I was conducting the orchestra, and it used that French violin clef, where G was the lowest line instead of the second to lowest line. Ugh. As you can see, the C clef moved all over the place, and even the bass clef got around, but luckily, not anymore. The Passion of 1001 Nights also featured a rhubarb spike fiddle and a canon, a zither box of strings, and they were playing heterophonically together, one single melody but differently ornamented in the two instruments. And they were accompanied by a doumbek drum. So it's time to talk about drums, don't you think? Yes, and here we are still with a relative plethora of drums. Starting with a little talking drum, possibly from West Africa. And, of course, the strings around here are tensed so that you can get different pitches. Here's the default. I'll tense it. Maybe. Typically played under the arm. So let's see if we can get anything. Maybe I do that Yoruba poetry. Gwala fishagwa. Gwala fishe. Beni konshi konshi kondu. Gwala fishe. Yeah, a little bit. 2 pottery drums from the Middle East, and that brings up another point, which is, depending on where you are in the world, geography determines destiny. In West Africa, there are a fair number of trees, so quite natural to make one's drums with the stretched membranes, also the log drums, out of wood. But in the deserts of Southwest Asia, not so many trees, so considerably more pottery drums. What would this be, camel's skin? Who knows? We've got that one, and we've got this one. One of them's broken. Another slice in the drum head. Guess which one? It's that one. Tragically, yeah, it still sounds pretty okay. You just never know. Ah, yes, there was a drum sitting over here, too, and we don't want it to be lonely, so we'll bring it over. But before we do, let's take a look at these two drums that are actually part of string instruments. The rhubarb fiddle, but it does have a drum resonator. You're not supposed to play it like that. And the erhu fiddle with a snakeskin. Let's put it over here. Snakeskin drum head. Sounds pretty good all by itself. From China. And we'll take a look at that again when we get to the string instruments. Okay, while we're over here, let's not move it. I think this is, rather than African, Native American. Something about the fuzziness of that drum head. I'm basing my assessment of that one on this one, which I do know is a Native American drum. Witness the deerskin head and the stringing of that one and this one seem similar. This is also a Native American drum. And again, can't remember where both of these were acquired, but my sense is that this one with the deerskin drum head is more of an Eastern manifestation, and this one more Western. And let's not forget a couple of bongos from a Latin American tradition. Actually, that's more of a Middle Eastern rhythm. Oh, habanera. That's Latin American. Oh, and one more double drum with these wonderful little flying doodles, balls. And so, what's not to like? And finally, I threatened to hit these pots outside, so I better do it. Actually, they sound pretty good. Half step apart. Yeah, well, I'd hear that as do, T, 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 and it's G to F sharp. It could be the Mibira that we had heard earlier. And one more since we're in the neighborhood. How about the pot that we used for the snake charmer? Yes.